In every war, there are stories buried deeper than the rubble, truths sealed behind steel doors and smudged ink in forgotten files. What history calls victory often leaves behind corridors of silence, where vanished convoys, erased massacres, and phantom laboratories whisper their secrets through the dust. Imagine archives too fragile to open, maps that stop abruptly at the coastline, reports signed but never filed. Behind each redaction is not just a secret, but a choice. What to conceal, what to abandon, what to erase. These are the echoes of shadows. Operations that existed only in the margins of official history. Projects dismantled, but never explained. Atrocities wrapped in silence rather than justice. As you listen, remember that these stories do not live in the pages of textbooks. They survive in the static between declassified lines, in the cold corridors where memory and secrecy meet. Once uncovered, they force a single question. How much of what we think we know was deliberately constructed to blind us? Chapter 1. The Forgotten Files of Operation Werwolf. In the closing months of the Second World War, as the Third Reich crumbled beneath the weight of advancing Soviet divisions and Allied armies, whispers began to circulate through the ruins of Germany. These whispers spoke of a clandestine order, an underground resistance that would outlive the Reich's collapse and fight on in silence. It was given a name that carried both menace and mystique: Operation Werwolf. Official histories often describe it as a failed Nazi propaganda initiative, a desperate attempt by Himmler and remnants of the SS to rally civilian militias in the spring of 1945. Yet within classified archives and fragments of declassified intelligence reports, a darker picture emerges. One where Werwolf was not merely propaganda, but an embryonic insurgency, whose traces remained long after the Reichstag had fallen in flames. The earliest surviving reference appears in a captured memorandum, dated March 23, 1945, signed by Heinrich Himmler himself, marked Nur für den Dienstgebrauch, for official use only. It outlined the creation of autonomous cells capable of sabotage, assassination, and intelligence gathering behind enemy lines. The document emphasized the use of concealed arms caches, pre-trained youth recruits drawn from the Hitlerjugend, and SS men instructed to disappear into the forests. Yet what stands out most are the references to future directives, suggesting continuity beyond surrender. Allied officers dismissed these as bluffs intended to frighten occupation forces, but the incidents that followed in the summer of 1945 suggest otherwise. On July 12, 1945, a convoy of Red Army trucks carrying medical supplies near Dresden was ambushed on a narrow road. Soviet records, unearthed decades later, note the use of explosives concealed in roadside ditches, detonated with a level of precision inconsistent with scattered partisans. 3 trucks were destroyed, 12 men killed. NKVD officers scoured the area, capturing several young Germans with no military insignia, but carrying small, pre-packaged satchels of dynamite manufactured in 1944. Interrogation. Transcripts record their insistence that they were acting under oath to an Oberfuhrer whose name was never revealed. British intelligence files preserved in the Public Record Office at Kew contain similar anomalies. A report from September 1946, classified as most secret, recounts the killing of Captain Harold Atkinson of the British Control Commission in Hanover. He was shot at close range while travelling between inspection sites. His driver, a German civilian, fled the scene and was never recovered. The incident was officially explained as criminal activity, but the file includes references to werewolf graffiti scrawled near the attack site, a wolf's head symbol painted in tar. MI5 officers attached to the case noted suspicion of an organised cell, though within weeks the file was closed, labelled matter resolved. American archives tell a similar story. The OSS, transitioning into the newly formed CIA, compiled dozens of incidents of concern in occupied Bavaria, where railway lines were sabotaged with explosives and telegraph wires cut during 1945 and 1946. While the majority of these were attributed to banditry or hunger riots, several OSS case officers believed the attacks bore hallmarks of structured planning. One memorandum dated January 1946 describes extraordinary discipline among arrested suspects, most of whom refused to speak even under extended questioning. The memo includes a chilling observation. Our interrogation techniques are proving ineffective. Suspects demonstrate indoctrination akin to fanaticized cells. suggesting prior psychological conditioning by SS handlers. Soviet files, declassified after 1991, further complicate the narrative. The NKVD's Special Dossier No. 117 details over 40 incidents across Saxony, Thuringia and Brandenburg between 1945 and 1947, ranging from arson attacks on supply depots to targeted killings of local collaborators. Yet none were ever publicly acknowledged in official Soviet reports. The reasoning, according to internal correspondence, was to avoid undermining the image of Soviet control. Any suggestion of organized resistance was erased from publications and reports, creating the illusion that Germany had been pacified. The most disturbing revelations, however, come from surviving testimony smuggled into Allied hands during the late 1940s. In one deposition, taken from a captured SS Hauptsturmführer named Karl-Heinz Loch, the prisoner described pre-war training schools in the Harz Mountains, where recruits were instructed in guerrilla tactics, demolition and assassination techniques. Loch claimed that senior SS officials ordered units to disperse into the civilian population in April 1945, with instructions to wait for coded radio transmissions that never arrived. He insisted these units were supplied with false identity papers, ration books, and maps of Allied troop positions. His testimony was filed and then vanished from archives for nearly 30 years. Whether Werwolf truly posed a lasting insurgent threat remains disputed among historians. Some argue it was little more than propaganda, a psychological weapon used by the Nazis to terrorize occupying forces. Others contend that it was a functional insurgency suppressed and later erased from the record for political reasons. The truth may lie in the grey space between. What is undeniable is that the occupation years were bloodier and more chaotic than post-war narratives admit. In October 1946, a train carrying coal into Frankfurt derailed after explosives detonated beneath the tracks. 4 Allied soldiers were killed in the wreckage. Local German newspapers described it as an accident caused by damaged rails. Yet an unredacted US Army CID report, uncovered decades later, states bluntly, "Explosive charge recovered near site indicates deliberate sabotage consistent with Werwolf operations." No suspects were ever apprehended. By the early 1950s, the incidents dwindled. The Cold War shifted focus toward the Soviet threat, and any narrative of continued Nazi resistance became politically inconvenient. Files were sealed, cases dismissed, and the concept of werewolf was relegated to footnotes, often dismissed as Nazi fantasy. Yet the shadows remain. Scattered reports, erased testimonies, and missing documents all suggest a campaign of resistance that was more than mere myth. Even today, fragments resurface. In 1998, construction workers near Leipzig unearthed a rusted steel container buried beneath a forest floor. Inside were grenades, ammunition, and a faded SS field manual marked Werwolf Einsatz 1945. German police confiscated the items, and official statements described them as war relics. Yet forensic analysis of the paper indicated it was printed in April 1945, during the collapse, and the instructions bore signatures matching officers believed to have coordinated werewolf operations. The story of Operation Werewolf is one of shadows, phantom cells, suppressed reports, and the uneasy silence of archives. Whether the resistance was a true coordinated movement or simply the lingering violence of a defeated nation, its traces bleed through in fragments. And in those fragments, one finds the unsettling possibility that the war did not truly end in May 1945, but continued in whispers and bloodshed for years, hidden beneath the veneer of Allied victory. Chapter 2: The Disappearance of the Baltic Convoy. On the night of April 28, 1945, as the Third Reich teetered on collapse, a convoy of German vessels slipped quietly out of the harbour at Gotenhafen, today's Gdynia, Poland. Official Wehrmacht naval records list the operation as a humanitarian transfer, part of Operation Hannibal, the massive evacuation of civilians and wounded soldiers across the Baltic Sea. But the convoy, marked under the codename Eisvogel, Kingfisher, was unlike the others. Its cargo manifests, preserved in fragmentary form in captured Kriegsmarine documents, list sealed containers marked only with the designation Sonderfracht A. These items were guarded by SS officers detached from the Sicherheitsdienst, whose presence on a supposed refugee convoy raised questions even at the time. Within 48 hours, Eisvogel would vanish without a trace. British intercepts from Bletchley Park offer one of the first hints of something unusual. On April 27th, a decrypted message flagged urgent preparations for the departure of a special consignment bound for Copenhagen, escorted by minesweepers. The message was forwarded to Naval Intelligence Division officers at the Admiralty, but the response was delayed, overshadowed by the imminent German surrender in Italy. Later annotations on the decrypt, released under the UK National Archives in the 1980s, contain redacted paragraphs referencing uranium oxide and radio components. Historians argue these may have been linked to the remnants of Germany's abortive nuclear program, centered in facilities at Haigerloch and Oranienburg. Survivor accounts, though scarce, complicate the record. A Danish fisherman named Erik Lund, interviewed in 1957, claimed to have seen a column of ships steaming west of Bornholm Island on the evening of April 29th. He described a haze of smoke on the horizon, followed by flashes of light, and then silence. He insisted the vessels were under attack, but no official battle records confirm such an engagement. British Royal Navy logs from HMS Onslaught, patrolling near the Skagerrak at the time, note sonar contact with an unknown formation, but record no confirmed kill. Curiously, the after-action report filed by Captain R.G. Parsons was amended 3 months later, with entire sections cut out by naval intelligence. The Soviets offered yet another narrative. NKVD naval intelligence records, declassified in fragments after the collapse of the USSR, claim that submarine L-21 shadowed a German convoy departing Gotenhafen in late April. The report asserts that the convoy disappeared suddenly after evading pursuit near Bornholm. One line, heavily censored, mentions foreign intervention. Some researchers argue this suggests Allied forces intercepted the convoy, while others believe the Soviets themselves may have seized its cargo in secrecy. What is clear is that Moscow made no public claim of sinking or capturing Eisvogel, a silence that speaks volumes given the propaganda value it might have held. What could have been so valuable aboard those ships to warrant such secrecy? A 1946 US Army Counterintelligence Corps report references rumors of uranium ore stockpiles being moved by sea in the final weeks of the war. At the time, American intelligence was racing against the Soviets to secure Germany's nuclear assets. Known as the Alsos mission, these operations had already captured scientists like Werner Heisenberg and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, along with several tons of uranium oxide stored in barrels. Yet CIC officers noted gaps in the tallies, shipments that vanished from warehouses in April 1945, just before Allied forces arrived. Could Eisvogel have carried these missing materials? The mystery deepens when examining post-war diving expeditions. In 1976, a Polish salvage team searching for wrecks near Bornholm reported unusual interference with their sonar equipment, which they attributed to metallic debris fields. Subsequent dives were abruptly halted by the Polish government, citing safety concerns. Western intelligence files from the Cold War confirm that both Soviet and East German naval units patrolled the area aggressively, discouraging any attempts to recover sunken vessels. This secrecy fueled speculation that Eisvogel's remains lay beneath the Baltic, carrying cargo that neither East nor West wanted revealed. A particularly compelling piece of evidence surfaced in 1992, when a German researcher named Dr. Reinhard Bremer accessed newly opened Stasi archives in Berlin. He uncovered a file referencing versunkene Frachten, sunken cargoes in the Baltic, linked specifically to uranium shipments intercepted by Western naval units. 1945. The document mentioned cooperation between American and British forces in removing wreckage from the seabed near Bornholm, though it did not specify whether the cargo was recovered intact. If true, it would suggest that the convoy was intercepted, sunk, and quietly salvaged by Western powers, its existence erased from official records. Yet the conspiracy theories surrounding Eisvogel are not limited to nuclear materials. Some researchers believe the convoy carried advanced radar prototypes from the JEMA laboratories, devices that could have given post-war powers an edge in early missile detection systems. Others suggest it transported stolen European gold reserves, funneled out of occupied territories, and intended to finance a post-war Nazi network. Supporting this theory is a declassified OSS memorandum, dated August 1945, referencing gold bars unaccounted for, likely transferred by sea during evacuation operations. While circumstantial, The timing aligns with Eisvogel's disappearance. By the late 20th century, Eisvogel had become a symbol of vanished wartime secrets. Historians attempting to track its fate encounter nothing but contradictions. Naval logs rewritten, survivor testimonies suppressed, archives missing crucial files. In 2001, German divers exploring wreck sites near Rügen reported discovering a vessel consistent with one of Eisvogel's escort ships, but before further dives could be conducted, the site was declared off-limits by federal authorities citing unexploded ordnance. To this day, no confirmed wreckage of the main transport ships has been verified. The silence of governments on both sides of the Cold War suggests more than coincidence. If Eisvogel carried uranium ore, then its capture could have directly influenced the nuclear arms race. If it held gold or technology, its recovery could explain the sudden financial and scientific leaps of the immediate post-war years. And if it was truly sunk and unrecovered, the Baltic seabed may still conceal one of the greatest untold stories of the war's chaotic final days. In the end, Eisvogel exists in a liminal space between recorded history and rumour. The official record states it was a refugee convoy lost at sea, yet scattered across British decrypts, Soviet submarine logs, OSS memoranda, and whispered survivor accounts is another story, one carefully buried. Like so many shadows of the war's end, it lingers unresolved, its truth hidden beneath layers of silence and cold water. The Baltic still keeps its secrets, and Eisvogel remains among them, a phantom convoy erased from history, yet never forgotten. Chapter 3. Shadow Scientists of Operation Paperclip. In May 1945, as US forces swept across Bavaria and Thuringia, they found not just destroyed cities and surrendering garrisons, but laboratories. Laboratories stripped bare, files missing, chalkboards erased, and the men behind these vanished projects, chemists, engineers, physicists, were already making plans to trade their knowledge for survival. Within weeks, American officers from the Office of Strategic Services and the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency began drafting lists. The codename given was Operation Paperclip, a seemingly bureaucratic undertaking designed to secure German scientific expertise for American research. Official histories frame it as a recruitment of rocket experts like Wernher von Braun and his Peenemünde team, the visionaries who would help carry the United States to the moon. But declassified files reveal another side. Men whose hands were stained with war crimes. Men whose records were deliberately falsified before they were granted safe passage to America. Among the most telling documents is a memorandum dated November 18, 1946, authored by Colonel Donald Putt of the Army Air Forces. It lists 47 German specialists, all of whom were slated for relocation to Wright Field in Ohio. Beside several names is a handwritten note, SD ties, omit from press. One of those names was Dr. Kurt Blome, Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich, who had overseen human experimentation in biological warfare at Dachau. His original SS file marked him as a war criminal, but the Paperclip dossier described him only as an epidemiologist, experienced with plague prevention. He was flown to the United States in 1947, his crimes quietly erased. The practice was systematic. A captured set of interrogation transcripts from Camp Dustbin in Paris, where German scientists were first screened, shows American officers aware of atrocities. When asked directly about his work, one physicist admitted to testing nerve agents on prisoners at Natzweiler. The transcript ends abruptly, followed by a notation. Record sealed. Valuable. Recommend inclusion in Paperclip list. The scientist's name is blacked out in the surviving copy. Such redactions are frequent in the archives, a silence that speaks louder than testimony. The Soviets were not blind to this process. NKVD reports from late 1945 reference mass transfers of German specialists to the Americans under false identities. In one communique to Moscow, a field officer complained bitterly, "We are left with debris. Americans seize not only the rockets, but the men who built them." Stalin responded with his own version, forcibly relocating hundreds of German scientists and their families to facilities in the USSR. But the American effort was cloaked in greater secrecy, ensuring that the men they took would be portrayed not as criminals, but as pioneers. At Fort Bliss, Texas, one of the first paperclip groups was housed in relative comfort, surrounded by fences, but treated as honored guests. They worked on captured V-2 rockets, rebuilding them for test launches at White Sands Proving Ground. Official photographs show smiling German engineers in desert sunlight, their past blurred by the lens. Yet behind closed doors, reports circulated of tensions among the men. Some feared exposure, especially when Holocaust survivors testified in Nuremberg about medical crimes. The US Army kept strict control over which Germans were ever called as witnesses. Von Braun himself was nearly implicated due to his SS rank, but his value to America's missile program rendered the matter untouchable. His personnel file was rewritten, reducing his SS membership to nominal. The full extent of Paperclip's concealments only began to emerge decades later. In 1985, journalist Linda Hunt gained access to a batch of declassified files and discovered that more than 700 German scientists had been quietly brought into the U.S., many of them through falsified dossiers. Names associated with concentration camp experiments appeared on these rosters, their pasts sanitized. One CIA memorandum bluntly explained the rationale. In the emerging conflict with the USSR, technical value outweighs political liability, but even in the 1940s there were dissenting voices. In a July 1945 letter preserved in the National Archives, Justice Department official Samuel Klaus warned that admitting Nazi scientists under false papers would constitute a betrayal of the very principles for which we claim to have fought. His objections were ignored. By 1947, Klaus had been sidelined, his warnings buried in appendices stamped classified. Paperclip's reach extended beyond rockets and medicine. Files reveal specialists in aerodynamics, infrared guidance, and chemical engineering, many of whose projects would resurface in Cold War weapons systems. The X-15 hypersonic aircraft, the Atlas missile, and even NASA's Saturn V bore the fingerprints of men once sworn to Hitler. The irony was stark. Technology developed in the service of the Reich now launched astronauts into orbit, celebrated as achievements of freedom and democracy. The price of this progress was silence about its origins. The secrecy was not total. In 1949, the US Senate held hearings on the immigration of former Nazis. Some names surfaced, but hearings were curtailed before reaching the Paperclip files. In one rare testimony, a Jewish refugee named David Marcus recounted seeing a familiar face in an American research facility, a man he recognized as a guard at Dora Mittelbau, the camp where V-2 rockets were built with forced labor. His testimony was dismissed as mistaken identity. The man in question remained in US service until 1961. Soviet propaganda occasionally attempted to exploit the truth, accusing the Americans of harboring war criminals. Washington dismissed these claims as disinformation, confident that few would believe Moscow over their own officials. In reality, both sides were guilty, but the Americans controlled the narrative more effectively. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from a 1952 CIA field report, now partially declassified. It describes the death of a German scientist in New Mexico, allegedly from a heart attack. The report notes, almost in passing, that his quarters contained untranslated documents concerning high-altitude physiological research. These were never entered into official archives. The man's name, redacted, remains a shadow. By the time the truth began to seep out in the 1980s, many of the Paperclip scientists were elderly or dead. Von Braun himself had become an American hero, smiling on magazine covers, his Nazi past reduced to a footnote. Others slipped into obscurity, their wartime crimes buried beneath careers in American laboratories. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is thus twofold: the undeniable technological leap it gave the United States in the Cold War, and the moral cost of building that progress upon the silence of erased atrocities. In the archives, one sees the contrast starkly. Pages of technical diagrams beside redacted testimonies of human experiments, recruitment rosters beside missing trial transcripts. It is a ledger of progress written in shadows. In the end, Paperclip was not just an operation but a bargain, a decision that the future mattered more than the past. The United States gained rockets, weapons, and scientific prestige. What it lost was the clarity of justice. For every launch that lit the skies over white sands, there remained in the darkness the unanswered question of whose suffering had paid for the science. That question lingers still, written in blacked-out lines across government files that may never be fully revealed. Chapter 4. The Erased Massacre at Kalavryta. On December 13, 1943, the Greek village of Kalavryta became the site of one of the most infamous atrocities of the German occupation. In the official account, it was an act of reprisal, Wehrmacht forces executing over 600 men and boys in retaliation for the killing of German soldiers by local partisans. The burned houses, the destroyed school, and the blood-stained fields were recorded in both German and Allied documents as another example of partisan suppression. Yet fragments of erased correspondence and buried reports suggest that what happened in Kalavryta was more than blind vengeance. Behind the massacre may have been a concealed objective, a hunt for coded ledgers and resistance gold hidden in the mountains of Achaia. Captured Wehrmacht records describe the unit involved as elements of the 117th Jaeger Division, commanded by General Karl von Lesueur. Their orders, issued on December 10th, were to conduct Operation Kalavryta, an anti-partisan sweep aimed at crushing resistance strongholds in the northern Peloponnese. Yet a copy of the division's operations diary, preserved in the Bundesarchive, contains peculiar entries. In the days before the massacre, officers noted repeated intelligence briefings from the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, about illicit finance trails tied to British agents. Specific references were made to gold shipments and coded records transferred through partisan channels in Achaia sector. These lines were crossed out in post-war copies but remain faintly legible on the originals. Survivor testimony gathered by Greek investigators after the war adds to this suspicion. Several villagers recalled that German troops did not immediately begin rounding up men when they entered Kalavryta. Instead, they searched buildings methodically, focusing on schools, churches, and the mayor's office. One survivor, Maria Papas, testified in 1946. They tore apart the teacher's desk and carried off ledgers. They searched beneath the church floorboards. This detail was not included in official tribunal transcripts, which emphasized only the executions. British archives shed further light. MI6 field reports from Cairo, declassified in the late 1990s, describe coded transmissions intercepted in November 1943. These messages, sent by resistance contacts in the Peloponnese, referred to gold bars from Piraeus diverted through Kalavryta for safekeeping. A follow-up message dated December 1st noted that the gold was hidden beneath sacred ground, awaiting collection. British analysts feared interception by German intelligence and noted that Abwehr had begun monitoring resistance couriers in the region. Within 2 weeks, German troops descended upon Kalavryta. Official Allied propaganda after the massacre condemned it as a barbaric atrocity, placing it alongside Lidis and Oradour sur Glane as symbols of Nazi cruelty. Yet within internal communications, there is evidence of unease. A memorandum from the British Foreign Office in February 1944 admits that certain sensitive economic matters linked to Kalavryta were not to be discussed in public forums. Another marked secret refers to loss of records in Kalavryta incident, possible enemy seizure of ledgers. The nature of these ledgers is never clarified, but later notes connect them to resistance funding lines involving smuggled bullion and foreign currency. German post-war testimonies are equally revealing. During interrogations conducted by the US Army in 1947, a former Jaeger officer recalled that SS advisors were present during the Kalavryta sweep, though officially the SS was not involved. He remembered their insistence on locating treasures and lists before executions began. His testimony was filed under case number 4321D and then quietly shelved. When German war crimes trials addressed Kalavryta in 1948, references to gold or ledgers were absent. The massacre was reduced to an act of collective reprisal, brutal but conventional. What happened to the alleged gold? Rumors persist that a portion was seized and redirected into secret Reich accounts in Switzerland. Greek resistance veterans claim the caches were never fully recovered, and some believe the Germans failed to locate the bulk of it before retreating. In the 1950s, villagers reported finding fragments of wooden chests buried in the soil near the monastery above Kalavryta, though any valuables had long since vanished. Equally mysterious are the missing documents. Several ledgers belonging to the local cooperative bank were never accounted for after 1943. Testimonies describe German officers carting away books wrapped in canvas sacks. One of these, according to a Greek archivist who studied partial fragments in the 1970s, contained coded entries listing deposits not in drachmas, but in British sovereigns and Reichsmarks. Whether these represented resistance funds, black market exchanges, or intelligence payments is unclear. The erasure of these details seems deliberate. At Nuremberg, the Kalavryta massacre was cited briefly, but without exploration of financial motives. The emphasis was placed entirely on the scale of civilian killings. Historians who sought access to the broader case files in the 1960s found large sections missing, particularly those referencing Abwehr involvement. A Greek Commission of Inquiry in 1965 reported archival gaps inexplicable in light of the atrocity's magnitude. The massacre itself left a permanent scar. The women and children of Kalavryta, spared from execution, were locked in the village school, while the men were marched to a hillside and gunned down. Survivors recalled hearing the volley of shots, followed by silence and the crackling of flames as homes were set alight. When the doors of the school were finally broken open, the village was in ruins. More than 700 were dead. For decades, the survivors spoke only of the brutality, not the possibility of hidden motives. Perhaps they were unaware, or perhaps the truth was suppressed in official remembrance. Cold War politics further obscured the story. Greece, locked in its own civil war and later drawn into NATO, had little appetite for revisiting suppressed truths that might implicate Western intelligence or embarrass post-war Germany. Compensation negotiations with Bonn in the 1960s focused only on civilian losses, not on vanished gold or missing records. Files remained sealed, both in Athens and in London. In recent years, local researchers and archivists have tried to reopen the question. A 2003 study by the University of Patras uncovered fragments of MI6 cables referring obliquely to Kalavryta consignments, but official comment was withheld. In 2011, German journalists, working in the Bundesarchiv, located portions of the 117th Jäger Division's diary with clear signs of post-war tampering. The erased lines about illicit finance trails stood out as glaring anomalies. The massacre at Kalavryta remains etched in memory as an atrocity of unthinkable cruelty. Yet beneath the accepted narrative lies a possibility far darker. That the slaughter may have been, in part, a cover for theft and suppression of resistance financing. If true, it would transform the tragedy from senseless reprisal to calculated plunder. The victims would remain the same, but the motives would shift, revealing war not only as violence, but as economic predation executed under the fog of occupation. What endures is silence. The memorial in Kalavryta lists the names of the murdered, but it does not speak of ledgers, gold, or erased files. In the archives, scattered fragments still point to those lost dimensions, but no authority has yet admitted their weight. And so, the story remains unresolved, an atrocity remembered, yet also an enigma, its hidden motives buried beneath layers of fire, ash, and bureaucratic erasure. Chapter 5. The Ghost Facility Beneath Peenemünde. The ruins of Peenemünde, the remote Baltic outpost where Nazi Germany built its infamous V-2 rockets, stand today as a museum of science and destruction. Yet for decades, whispers persisted that what lay above ground was only half the story. Beneath the sand dunes and pine forests of Euston Island, fragments of testimony, sealed maps, and Soviet occupation reports suggest that another site existed, codenamed Nordstern. This facility, according to scattered records, was not concerned with ballistic rockets at all, but with propulsion systems intended to evade Allied detection entirely. Its traces, deliberately erased after 1945, remain among the most haunting shadows of the war. The first clues come from captured Luftwaffe memoranda dated February 1944, addressed to Reichsluftfahrtministerium (RLM) officials. These documents, fragmentary but preserved in the Bundesarchiv, Reference Untertageanlagen Nordstern, underground installations Nordstern, with allocations of steel and concrete well beyond what the official Peenemünde project required. Curiously, the supply requests bypass standard army channels, routed instead through the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, the same office overseeing concentration camp labor. No blueprints survive, but annotations reference Plasma-Antrieb, plasma propulsion, and Wellenabschirmung, wave shielding. Allied intelligence analysts in 1945, unfamiliar with the terminology, dismissed these as code words for radar jamming equipment. Later physicists would argue the descriptions were consistent with experimental high-energy propulsion concepts. When Soviet forces seized Euston in May 1945, they expected only the rubble of bombed launch sites. Yet an NKVD field report discovered in Moscow archives in 1993 paints a different picture. The report describes sealed chambers beneath the dunes, secured by demolition charges, partially collapsed but showing evidence of machinery. The Soviet engineers who entered reported scorched walls, shredded cabling, and vaults emptied of documents. What alarmed them most was the absence of bodies. While the Dora Mittelbau camp had supplied thousands of slave laborers to Peenemünde, not a single corpse was found in the underground site. The report concluded with a chilling line: personnel evacuated in haste, destination unknown. American forces, though denied access to Usedom after Soviet occupation, nevertheless gathered their own intelligence. A declassified 1947 U.S. Army Corps of Engineers annex, marked restricted, includes interviews with German prisoners who spoke of a black site near Karlshagen airfield. One prisoner, an SS technical officer named Otto Schultz, described an installation where aircraft without propellers were tested under heavy secrecy. He claimed entire transport columns carried crates marked with the Nordstern insignia. A stylized compass rose through concealed tunnel entrances. His testimony was filed but ultimately dismissed as exaggeration, folded into a broader paperclip sweep that focused instead on rocket scientists like Werner von Braun. The mystery deepened during the Cold War East. German security services maintained unusually tight control of the Peenemünde region, designating large stretches of forest off-limits even to locals. A 1962 Stasi directive classified the area as Sperrzone Rot, citing unexploded ordnance as the official reason. Yet defector testimonies suggest Soviet military engineers were still probing sealed tunnels well into the 1970s. Polish fishermen in nearby waters recalled seeing convoys of Soviet trucks leaving the island under guard, carrying covered cargoes westward. Western analysts speculated the Soviets may have salvaged components from Nordstern and integrated them into their own experimental propulsion research. Perhaps the most tangible clue appeared in 1985, when a Swedish diving expedition exploring wrecks off Usedom reported sonar contact with a submerged tunnel entrance. Divers attempting to investigate were turned back by East German naval patrols. The incident received brief coverage in Scandinavian newspapers before disappearing from public record. A decade later, after German reunification, local researchers petitioned to excavate suspected tunnel sites. Their requests were denied by the federal government, citing environmental risks and dangerous instability of underground structures. No excavations were ever officially permitted. Unpublished testimonies add further weight. In 1999, a former Soviet engineer named Anatoly Fedorov gave an interview in Kaliningrad, claiming he had been part of a team sent to secure Nordstern in 1946. According to Fedorov, they recovered large cylindrical objects, too heavy for trucks, which were cut apart with torches before removal. He described inscriptions in Gothic script and technical notes referencing Hochenergieversuchsanlagen, high-energy experimental installations. Fedorov insisted these items were shipped to facilities near Moscow, but he never saw them again. His account was never corroborated, yet it aligned with scattered German records mentioning equipment, not for flight rockets, but for next-generation systems. The absence of official acknowledgement is itself suspicious. In Allied archives, Nordstern appears only in passing footnotes, always crossed out or redacted. A British Air Ministry file from 1948 contains a marginal note: Peenemünde secondary site, possible advanced propulsion, Soviet zone, no further action. An American Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency roster from the same year lists several scientists with Nordstern affiliations, but their names were redacted when the file was released in 1978. These deliberate silences suggest that whatever Nordstern was, its implications remained sensitive long after the war. Today, the landscape of Usedom shows little trace. Concrete bunkers crumble into the dunes, overgrown with pine and grass. The tourist museum at Peenemünde presents the V2 as the central story, a tale of rockets that bridged the gap between war and space exploration. Beneath the surface, however, fragments of testimony and erased files hint at something else. An installation sealed before the Soviets arrived, emptied of equipment, its workers vanished without record. The unanswered questions remain unsettling. Was Nordstern merely a camouflage designation for radar research, or did it represent a genuine leap into experimental propulsion? Were the missing workers executed, or were they absorbed into post-war programs under new masters? And why, decades after the fall of the Reich, do governments still resist full excavation of the sites? The evidence is scattered. Luftwaffe memoranda, Soviet field reports, redacted interrogations, and the testimony of aging witnesses. None prove conclusively that Nordstern was more than myth, yet together they form a pattern, a shadow beneath the official history of Peenemünde, a ghost facility sealed by explosives, guarded by secrecy, erased from maps, but never entirely forgotten. If the rockets of Peenemünde changed the course of modern warfare and space exploration, what lay hidden beneath the dunes may have promised something even greater or darker. Until the sealed chambers are opened, Nordstern remains an enigma of the war's end, a phantom installation where silence itself is the final line in the archive. The past does not rest in monuments or museums. It lingers in the silences. In the locked cabinets no archivist is permitted to touch. In the tunnels that collapse just as excavators arrive. What remains hidden was never lost by accident, but buried with intention, guarded not by walls, but by fear of what revelation might bring. These shadows are not just remnants of a war long ended, but fractures in memory that shape the present in ways unseen. To chase them is to step into corridors where light never reaches, to confront the possibility that the greatest secrets are not about weapons or battles, but about the choices men made to bury truth itself. The question is not whether these forgotten files exist. The question is why they were silenced, and what happens if silence can no longer hold. The ghosts of history wait, patient and unyielding, for the day someone dares to listen.